as you said, I'm Jennifer Wong, and I'm going to be presenting Translating React. So you can find me at MyBlueWristband on Twitter or at mochimachine.com. And if you want to check out the slides, they're at genzor.github.io/translating-react. So you're probably wondering, other than that intro, like, who am I? And here's some photos of me. I just recently came back from a trip to Mongolia, and obviously I really like animals. So I'm riding a horse, a yak, a camel, and then holding a golden eagle. So what do I do normally when I'm not hanging out with animals? I'm actually a product engineer at Envoy, and we're hiring, and we love remote workers. So come and find me afterwards if you're interested in working with Envoy. And we also have a headquarters in San Francisco. So if you love animals like I do, here's a sampling of some of the dogs that hang out in our office. So a little story about switching frameworks. So I used to work for a company, possibly the one where I worked with Ben, and I see another coworker that I used to work with in the crowd named Gago. And so we used to be on Backbone, and we were making a big switch over to React. And those senior engineers were like this. Oh my God, React. And I was like, what is that? And they were like, it's components. And I was like, what is that? And so they did do a really good job of onboarding us and explaining to us what React was. And at the same time, if you didn't follow along, it was like this. Nothing stops this train. It's just this React train is going. So in the midst of all of that, I felt a little bit like this. Like, what even is React? So to start off, I decided to take a look at the React website, of course. So this is what the homepage looks like. You can see a little bit of information. There's a lot of really great documentation, and I'm sure all of you know this. There's a getting started page, there's a tutorial, lots of information about documentation on React, but not a ton about the inner workings of React and what they mean. So the first line you see is that React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. It's pretty straightforward. And they have three main points on the homepage, the first of which is that React is declarative. And that makes your views, or declarative views, make your code more predictable and easier to debug. And I was like, okay, that's not bad. And we have already talked about components. And sorry for anyone who's tired of the Lego analogy, but here's some more Lego components. And then the last thing that they say is that you learn React once and you can write it anywhere. They say that they don't make any assumptions about the rest of your technology stack, so you can develop new features in React without rewriting existing code. React can also render on the server with Node, and it can power mobile apps using React Native. And so I kind of felt like, okay, but you said that I can use React without rewriting existing code. And I was rewriting existing code right then. So I felt a little bit like this, okay. But of course, nothing stops the React train. So I just started plugging away at writing React without really understanding what I was doing. And so what are some of the confusing things about React to me? Well, honestly, at the beginning, I used to forget that React is actually just JavaScript. Because people always talk about React and they say components, as we know. They say it's JSX. They say it's the virtual DOM. And I'm like, but we're just talking about React, and I don't understand what all of these things are. And then I realized, oh yeah, React is open source, so it's all on GitHub. So here's React on GitHub. We have the whole source code available to us, which is awesome. So we can actually see that within the React library, there's a package called React. So it's like, okay, let's take a look at React. And then if we dig a little bit deeper, within that package, there's the source code to react.js. So this is what that file looks like. And it's kind of a little bit of a long file, but if we take a look, you can see there's a bunch of imports, and there's this const called React, where you kind of set some key value pairs. And then you just export this default React. And that's literally all React is. So So I was like, okay, that's not too scary, so maybe I can figure this out. So it's time to get all of your hard hats on. You guys all have your hard hats, right? Did they give them out to you? Sorry, well, okay. Well, we're gonna do some code spelunking, so just like cover your head, okay? Okay, so back to that file, React packages, React source, react.js. So again, we see a bunch of these imports. So really, that isn't just what React is. There are all these modules that we're importing into React. And then, of course, we see that const React that I mentioned earlier, where we're, again, setting this key children to a bunch of different values. And then a bunch of these different key value pairs. We see some methods that we recognize, et cetera. And when I looked at this, I realized, oh my God, React is just an object. Wow, that makes things like so much clearer. So now that we know what React is, kind of, let's look at the basis of React. So I think of the basis of React as React elements. And we all know that in JavaScript, you can grab elements from the DOM using document.getElementById. You can create elements using document.createElement. So we're going to create this div, and then we're going to give it some text content, and then we're going to give it the class name protestDiv. And then we're going to append that element to our root element using rootElement.appendChild. So that's how we write it in JavaScript. The same code in React looks almost exactly the same. We create a we grab the root element. We create a React element, though, this time, using react.createElement. So we're creating a div again. We give it a class name, the same one, and the same text content. And then instead of using appendChild, we use react.dom.render, where we render the element into our root element. So looking at these two pieces of code together, they look very similar. And so when I saw those two pieces of code, I was like, well, if they're so similar, like, why do we even have react.createElement? So let's take a look at that. Like, where does that come from? We'll just take a closer look here. So within that package, React, we take a look again at the source code, react.js, and you can see that we're importing createElement from react_element. So we're moving from react.js to react_element.js. So digging further down into the rabbit hole. So here's what createElement looks like inside of react_element.js. So we see this function here, and it's a little bit long. So that's the whole function, createElement. So I'm just going to focus on these two lines here. We see that we're exporting the function createElement. It takes in a type, config, and children, and then we're returning something called a React element that takes in a bunch of these configs. So then I had the question, well, what's a React element? So again, we're going to take a closer look at that. So this is React element inside of react_element.js. So we see that React element in the comments is a factory method to create a new React element. So it no longer follows a class pattern, so we don't use new to call it. So essentially, it's just a factory that spits out and returns React elements. So digging further into that code, we see that we're creating this const called element, and then if we scroll down the page a little bit, we just return that element. So we're creating elements and returning elements, and I was like, oh, so there's this other const called element, and we're setting these key value pairs again, and I realized that React elements are actually just another object. And I was like, oh, okay, that makes a little bit more sense. So what are all these properties that go along with this React element? And that's what I kind of like to say is like some of the React magic comes from these properties. So these are the built-in properties that are part of a React element. You have a type, a key, a ref, and props, and those are things that you don't get out of the box by using JavaScript versus using React. So we're just scratching the surface of React here. And actually, we've come a little bit full circle at this point. So you can see this function that we just used, we use createElement, and you can see what createElement is doing and how we call it. So we've gone from react.createElement inside of react.js to react.createElement to react_element in .js to React element in react_element.js. So it's a lot of files to like dig into to understand what you're doing when you just call react.createElement. But guess what? There's an easier way. It's JSX. We all know that. And we're excited by it. So when I first looked up JSX, I was like, what is that? And I read that JSX is a statically typed, object-oriented programming language designed to run on modern web browsers. And I was like, wait, what? Is that right? A faster, safer, easier JavaScript. And I realized this is not the JSX that we're looking for. So when I dug a little bit deeper, I found this draft JSX specification, which is published by Facebook and available at facebook.github.io/JSX. And that's actually the JSX that we are looking for. Interestingly, neither of them has a logo, but there's an open issue with JSX, the language, for a mascot or a logo, which I think is really funny. Because when I dug a little bit deeper, I saw that like maybe they want to use this tuna as their logo. And this is what someone made as the logo for JSX. Faster, easier, safer JavaScript. So if anyone from Facebook's out there listening, I'd highly recommend taking this tuna and maybe grabbing it before the other JSX does. So, okay, the JSX we're talking about is actually JavaScript XML, and Facebook's specification says that it's an XML-like syntax extension to ECMAScript. So it's like, okay, that's pretty interesting. And what it says also is that JSX is just syntactic sugar for calling react.createElement, which means you don't have to keep calling it over and over again. And I was like, that's pretty sweet, like literally and figuratively. We love syntactic sugar in JavaScript, right? So JSX, again, anything you can do with JSX can actually just be done in plain JavaScript, which is pretty cool. So JSX and JavaScript are kind of like this. Anything you can do, I can do better. And this is a reference to Annie, Get Your Gun, in case you guys didn't know. It's a really good song. So how does React fit into JSX? So React comes with a default set of syntax transformers, and those ship with Babel. So if we dig in a little bit about that, we can get to Babel's website, and we see the Babel plugin transform React JSX, which is pretty cool. It just happens automatically. You transpile JSX into React, and that's how it's built into it. So one funny thing is that since JSX compiles into calls to react.createElement, you always have to include the React library in the scope of any JSX you write. So I always like to say, don't you forget about React. Okay, so let's take a look at some transpiled JSX. We're just going to look at our original React element we created earlier. So here's our protest div. We get to write it in this cool like HTML-like syntax or XML-like syntax, and we basically see that we're spitting out react.createElement and getting that same call that we wrote earlier, which is awesome. So a note about JSX, which I'm sure many of you know because you are here at a React conference, but there are lots of protected words in JSX. So you have to, or in HTML, so you have to write them a certain way using camel case. And so I read on Facebook's site that React DOM uses camel case property naming convention instead of the HTML attribute names. And I was like, huh, so it's coming from React DOM. So I started looking around for it, and I was like, ah, I found it. It's in this file, React DOM source shared protected possible standard names. And this is what the file looks like. I'm just going to go down this list, maybe very quickly because it's quite long. So these are all of the protected words exported as possible standard names. It's almost 500 lines, so it's really long. Yeah, so that's protected words. And another thing that used to kind of confuse me about JSX were curly braces. I was like, what are these curly braces? I used to get them mixed up with template literals all the time. And so I'd be looking at curly braces like this, like, I don't understand what you are. But again, if we look back at Facebook's website, we can see that those curly braces are used for JavaScript expressions within JSX or within the children of React. So in other words, it's JavaScript living inside of a JSX world. Okay, so moving on. Now that we have like an easier way of using React.createElement, let's make some components. If you guys can tell, I really love this GIF. It's one of my favorite on the internet. Okay, so React components. So poking around React some more, we can see, again, in that original file, react.js, that we're importing component and pure component from React-based classes. So this is what React-based classes looks like inside of GitHub, and we can see it's still part of that React package. So just looking at the function component within that file, we can see that basically it takes in some props, some context, and an updater. So basically, it's a way of reassigning your props with every instantiation of your particular component. So React components are always like give me my props, I want new props, and I want to reassign props depending on like what I'm doing at the particular time. So again, going back to our original element, which we created earlier, we can actually rewrite that as a component. And this is how we would rewrite it as a component, as we know. So it's a class component. Basically, we're rendering the div that we created, but this time we're actually feeding in some props. And so this particular prop I'm going to call chant. And so anytime you instantiate your class component called protest, you always give it a prop called chant. So React reads this, and the way that we created our create element as essentially the same thing. And the reason why is because I'm not getting into state. But as we know, like the difference between a React element and a component is that components can take in state. And unfortunately, in this talk, I don't have time to get into state. So we're just going to say like, okay, we've got props, so that's pretty cool. So now that we have a component, let's render it to the DOM. So in order to render it to the DOM, we were using React DOM.render. So let's see where React DOM lives. And taking a look at React packages again, we see that React DOM is a separate package to React. And when I first started writing React, I was like, why do we have React, and we have React DOM, and we have to import both? That seems so silly. And then I realized that like abstraction is pretty important. Especially when it comes to like adorable golden retrievers. Like 2 is better than 1, and maybe not easier to maintain, but in code, it is easier to maintain. Okay, so we have this package called React DOM. And this is what it looks like on GitHub. This is, further down the page, there's some documentation about it, and we can see some of the API associated with React DOM. So we're going to focus on the client-side API, and specifically on the render function, because that's what we were using earlier. So again, digging into this package, React DOM, we find the source, and then we go to the client, and the client folder, and then we find React DOM.js. And inside of there, we find our render function. So the render function basically just takes in an element, a container, and a callback, and that's how we were calling it earlier. But then I looked a little bit closer, and I was like, oh, we're actually returning this other function, and it's called legacy render subtree into container, which also takes in an element, container, and callback, but also takes in these like null and false arguments, and I'm like, I don't know what those are. So we're still in this React DOM.js file, and that's where legacy render subtree into container lives. So if we take a look at this file, if I scroll down the page a little bit, we can see that that's actually returning DOM renderer.getPublicRootInstance. And I was like, what's DOM renderer? So again, still in React DOM.js, we can see that we're returning that, and then we're actually importing everything from DOM renderer, and that's actually coming from React reconciler /inline.dom. And I was like, whoa, what is that thing? So digging into that, I found another React package called React reconciler, and we're basically, all we're doing here is importing everything from React Fiber Reconciler. So what is that? And I was like, I don't know what React Fiber Reconciler is. So to break it down a little bit, we kind of already know what React is, right? Yeah. And because you're at a React conference, I'm sure most of you already know what Fiber is. But I found this really great article on Free Code Camp called Let's Fall in Love with Fiber. And it's written by Ryan Jurkinen. And he says, for the too long didn't read, that React Fiber is just an internal engine change. So that's what Fiber is. And he also says that React will walk through the virtual tree, find what's changed, and update as little as it can. This could mean updating one class attribute, or it could mean tearing down the entire DOM. And that's what's called reconciliation. So that's where the reconciler piece of React Fiber Reconciler comes from. And again, like, that's just like more of the React magic. It's like exactly how React works. How does it decide what elements or components to re-render at any given time? It's by this reconciler. So speaking of magic, did you know that React also has some secrets? So if I told you, it wouldn't be a secret, but I'm going to tell you anyways. So digging around again that react.js file, I found this key called secret internals do not use or you will be fired. And I was like, ooh, tell me what that is. Okay, so that's in react.js. We see it here. It's actually being assigned the value React shared internals. And I was like, what's that? So we see that we're in the same file, we're importing React shared internals from the module React shared internals. And then, so I went to React shared internals, and I saw that React shared internals is actually being assigned as this object that has React current owner and assign. And I was like, okay, now we're getting even closer. So React current owner in the same file is being imported from another module called React current owner. And I was like, what's that? So I dug into that, and then I saw that inside of React current owner, we see that that's getting assigned to another object that says current, and that may get assigned as a value of fiber, and current dispatcher may get assigned as dispatcher. So where do fiber and dispatcher come from? And of course, they come from React reconciler, which is exactly what we were just talking about earlier. So we went from React.js to React shared internals to React current owner to React reconciler. And again, React reconciler is React Fiber reconciler, and it's where the React magic lives. So interestingly, if you go to GitHub and you look at the documentation for React reconciler, they say that it is an experimental package for creating custom React renderers. Its API is not as stable as that of React, React Native, or React DOM, and does not follow a common versioning scheme. Use at your own risk. And I was like, ooh, that's kind of scary. But again, that's a lot of the React magic. And it's pretty cool. Like, you could, write your own renderer, which is awesome. Okay, whew. So that was a long way to Spelunk. We're like down at the bottom and climbing back up to the top. And we've come essentially to the end of the talk. So based on all of this, I did a lot of spelunking, and I learned a lot about React. And I highly encourage everyone to do that as well. Like, just dig into the internals of this library and framework, and you'll get a better sense of like what React is doing every time you type a line of React or JSX. So that next time you're writing some more React, you can be like really ready and prepared with all your newfound knowledge, just like I was. And I've been using React a lot on like side projects, and I really love it. It's been great. But sometimes with that newfound knowledge, you have to say no to React too. So this is a pull request on one of my repos called Developers, and a guy basically was like, well, I'm on a React kick, so I'm going to translate your entire website to React. And then I looked at it and I was like, I know a little bit more about React now, and my repo is 250 lines of code, and React is 8,000 lines of code. So I'm going to say no to that pull request. So again, using your newfound knowledge, even if it means like saying no to React, it's super helpful and really awesome. And so again, encourage spelunking anytime. So big thanks. When I was first learning React, I found this awesome beginner's guide to React via this guy named Ben. You guys might have heard of him. And it's on egghead.io. It's this really awesome class taught by Kent C. Dodds. He's speaking after me, which I'm really excited about. And it really helped me understand the inner workings of React really well. And that's it. Thanks, friends.